Welcome back, everybody, to Advanced Programming Concepts using C++. My name is Alex Louis. Today we're going to talk about returning a value from a function. There are times when you will need to write a function, and instead of having the return type void, which is really something we usually don't do, is you want to have the function return something back to the caller. So let me give you an example. In this particular case, we're still with the concept of the black box. So here's black box. You can call this, we're going to write something called sum. So we'll call this sum, right? And we already went over what can come in, which are when you define a function, are your parameters, and when you call it is going to be an argument. So I'll just say argument and then argument. So far we've been writing functions that are void. The return type is void. We're going to start writing functions where we're going to be returning a value back to the caller. What's coming out in terms of a result is a term called a return value. If I wrote this function called sum, I'd want to calculate the function, and I don't necessarily want to write any output, because if somebody that's calling the sum function, they may want to write the output in a different way. Maybe they want to format it in a different way with a formatting library, which is why it's not a good idea when you're creating functions to print anything out. You just want to come in with your arguments, and then you want to return a value back to the caller. In this case, if we were going to write a function that's going to return a sum, first we must define how many values we're going to sum up. We'll make it simple. In this example, we're going to do 2 values. If I were to write the function header, the return value, the first thing you need to do is decide what is the return value. Well, if you need to figure out what the return value is, you should look at your inputs that are coming in. Usually they will be related. In this example, what's coming in is we're going to decide that the parameters that we're going to define are only going to be integer, which means that anybody that's calling our function must pass it two parameters, 2 arguments, and the arguments themselves must be of integer data type. Again, I know I went back to the input, but that's usually how it goes. When you're writing a function, you must decide what the return value is, and that's usually going to be based on what the inputs are. Sometimes it's not. As you get more complex, there are other couple of rules that come in, but I'm just going to give you a straight out strategy on how to decide. Simple, right? Simple strategy. Then as we get more experience, that's where your art comes in. The first step is choose a return value. In this case, we're going to add 2 integers, so I'm just going to say that my return value is going to be an integer data type. So I forgot to write type here. Great. We already know the name. We can just call it sum. And then so how many parameters? We've decided that we're only going to do 2 parameters, right? So 2. And then data type of parameters. And the data type is going to be int for both. This is the strategy that I use when I write a function. It seems that it's not logical because we're actually starting from the return value back to the input instead of doing input process output. but this is, for me, this is a simpler way to express a strategy to create a function header. Let's take a look at writing. So now it's easier for us to write a function header, because what is our return value type? It's an int. What's the name of our function? Sum. And how many parameters? 2. And what's the data type? Int. 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 So what we've done here is write a prototype. Now, by you knowing the prototype, then you can start the definition of the function. And that's my strategy for you to pick up, and I'm sharing this with you when writing a simple or any type of simple functions. Start with the value, the return value type, and then work your way back to the input. Let's take a look at the code. I don't want you to pay attention to the main because I've sugar-coated the main with some extra stuff by reading data in. But I want you to really focus on the function itself. So over here, what we've done is we've just followed the guidelines that we did before, right? Where if we go back, we have the int, that's the return value, right? So we can say that this is the return value. So that's what that's basically this right here. And that's what we're receiving back. So that's what this is. This is the name of the function that you're writing. And then I'm going to call my parameters num1 and num2. Simple as that, right? Now, you as a developer should already know how to logically write the code, right? This is something we went over in programming 1. How do you find the sum of two numbers? Well, you declare a result. You take the parameters that are given and add them together. And then we'll store the result. Here's where the magic happens, where it's a little different, right? We're not writing data out in a function. We should not write data out in a function. And I will seldomly ask you to write data out in a function. What we want to do is instead return a result back to the caller. And by me returning this result, whoever calls this function is going to get back just the answer, nothing else. And I wouldn't want anything else. So if I'm calling your function, I don't want anything else but the result. And you've seen that with other functions, right? So if you call the POW function, all it's giving you is the exponent result, right? If you take a square root function, all you're getting is the square root, correct? And that's all you want. You don't want anything extra. You don't want anything printed out here. In later lectures, I'll show you that you can debug some stuff inside a function by printing things out. But those are just debug statements. We're not going to keep them in our function. So your function should be clean. There should really be no cout statements here. And you have parameters coming in and then one result coming out. Now let's take a look at the actual code here. And what I want to do is actually look at this. Now we're going to take a closer look. Point of entry is main. We've already established that, right? So again, point of entry is over here, right? Assume that the prototype is somewhere up here, right? And now we're doing a couple things here, right? What we're doing is we are going to first ask for input from the user. In this case, you see my cout statements. I'm asking for number 1 and number 2. Instead of me performing the calculation in my main, I am going to pass in the variables into my sum function, because I know that my sum function is going to return a value. And when you understand or know that the function itself is going to return a value, then you know the data type that it's going to return. And if you know the data type, then you know what your resulting variable's data type should be. Again, this is a integer, right? They get passed in, makes a copy, remember pass by value, right? Makes a copy of number 1 and number 2, and then goes into num1. So visually, if you see something in this picture here, is we have number 1, right? This is inside main, right? Inside, in between, we make a call, and we're making a copy, right? So whatever that value is, let's say it's 20, right? So this was originally the number, somebody entered 20. You make a copy of it, and then this is sum. Inside the sum function, num1 gets assigned the value 20. Same thing with number 2, right? Let's say they entered 40. Make a copy of it, of our function, our variable. Make a copy of that. So we have a copy of number 2, which is 40. And that copy goes inside num2. Which means that if I change the value of num1 inside my sum function, so we'll just call this f of x, nothing's going to happen to number 1 because it's a pass by value. We're making a copy of it. We're not actually passing in the actual variable itself, the reference. And we'll get to more of that in a couple of lectures coming up. Great. So now num1 and num2 are inside my function. We've declared result inside here. The scope of result is only exists within my sum function. So outside of sum, it's kaput. It no longer exists. If I try to reference in main result, it would not work. So any variable that you declare inside your function, the scope of that variable is only within your function. So you have to remember that. Make sure you understand that. If you declare any variables inside a function, unless they're static, which is a whole different ball game, and there's still some stuff to that, but we'll get to that. But for now, any variables that you declare within your function, the scope of the variable is only within this function. Which means that if I try to do something up here and reference result, it's no good. It's no good. I can't do that. Now I have result inside my function, and I'm going to assign it the sum of number 1 and number 2. Right? And that's going to be, the result's going to be 60. Okay? Well, assuming that number 1 is 20 and number 2 is 40, we're going to return, this is very important, we're going to return the result, the value of the variable back. What you're returning back is, again, a copy of result. And the value of, in this case, is going to be 60, right? But you're actually returning the variable, which is result, but you're actually returning just a value, okay? So in this case, we have 60, and that is assigned to result sum, which is a variable inside my main. Result sum is a variable inside my main, and that has a scope of only my main. With functions, what we want to do is we want to call the function and then assign it to a variable within the scope of wherever we are. So in this case, we're inside main. So I'm going to declare a result sum inside main. And that result sum is, again, the scope of that is within main. And when I call the sum function, whatever returns back, I'm going to assign it to that resulting variable. And you've done this before with the pal function, correct? Or the square root function, or the size of function. And then what we can do now is, now that we have the result, which in result sum, we can now reference it within our main. So here I'm just printing out the value of the sum, essentially. Now you have to remember, how do I know what data type to use for the resulting variable? I know by the return type of the function. In this case, the return type is an int, so result sums data type has to be an int. If I was doing some type of multiplication or division and I wanted a floating point result, then I would use a double. So this would be a double, and then this would have to be a double. Okay, so this is, I think at this point I'm going to stop a bit, and then maybe you can write a function. So why don't you write a function that finds the average of 3 test scores. And what I can tell you is this function is going to find the average, and it's going to return the average back to the caller. And I'm going to give you a hint here. So the result has to be a double. It's got to be a floating point. You can make it a double, you can make it a float, whichever floats your boat. So why don't you work on that, and then I'll see you on the next video.